last year, I had a number of people from Number 10 and sort of ministers say to me, basically, that Dominic Cummings was right, like it doesn't work.
Now, that is one of the least sexy sentences you could ever put in a manifesto, right?
And really, the government is at a crossroads. It needs to choose now to decide whether it's going to change course, because otherwise, by the end of this parliament, realistically, we're going to see food bank need rising.
Welcome to another episode of The Division Bell. This week we're talking U-turns, Brexit, and we're joined by Sumi Rabindrakumar from Trussell to talk about food banks and disability cuts. I'm Lizzy Buchan.
I'm Christian Calgie.
And this is The Division Bell.
What a week it has been. Lots to cover. We'll start with what happened yesterday at Prime Minister's questions, when a not at all planted question by a Labour backbencher finally confirmed that Keir Starmer is going to be performing a at least partial U-turn on winter fuel allowance. Do you want to talk us through what our current understanding is on what that U-turn involves, timing, and what led up to this major change of policy?
I mean, the details pretty scant right now. All we know is the PM stood up yesterday and said he wants to ensure that more pensioners are eligible for the winter fuel allowance. So for any listeners who sort of forgotten the many times we've talked about this, the payment is sort of up to £300, and it was all pensioners were eligible for it until Rachel Reeves decided to means test it last summer. And this has become just an albatross around the party's neck. It's become a nightmare. It's so unpopular. MPs hate it, but it was a nightmare on the doorstep. Obviously, it came up repeatedly at the local elections. So yesterday, the Prime Minister just said, I want to extend eligibility, and didn't really say anything more about what that was. So we went into, I don't know if you were in the huddle yesterday.
I missed it, unfortunately.
It was a doozy. So we do these huddles after Prime Minister's questions with the PM spokesman, political officials, and we couldn't get them to say whether it's even whether they know whether it will come in this winter or not. All we know at the moment is a decision is going to be made at the next fiscal event, which is the budget in October. So October a decision, but it's not clear whether that could be enacted in time for the next winter, who it would apply to, whether they are going to do a partial or even a full U-turn. We know the direction they're going in, but other than that, we don't know a great deal more.
Our guts are suggesting it's not going to be a full U-turn. And
I think that's right.
At the moment, we say that Rachel Reeves is means testing it. The particular criticism is the cut-off point, which is 11,500, which is not much at all, is it? If we were talking about, a working age, welfare, people would be quite outraged. So, I presume they're going to try and find a way to increase that to 20, 25,000 something. And again, as you say, it's quite late to leave the U-turn. Also, just again, bizarre to announce it now, so far ahead of the budget, when all of these questions now remain. Another key question, how they're planning on paying for it. Keir Starmer yesterday implied that it's because the economy is now growing, which is just such unbelievable nonsense. So, where is the money actually coming from? We had 0.7% growth I think it was the first quarter of this year. We actually had the first quarter growth of 2024. The Tories were in power and apparently the economy wasn't very good. Is this damaging for Rachel Reeves? There's a question of whether Starmer writes it out, but Reeves in particular, it's her who's been fronting up this claim of a £22 billion black hole. It's her who made this issue so central to that. Said, yes, of course it's unpopular, but we have to do it. Indeed, actually last week, was it the week before, the government were trying to claim that they couldn't have got the India trade deal over the line if they hadn't taken this decision. none of it.
I think that was your interpretation of what they said.
It was my interpretation, and I questioned them afterwards in this huddle, and they said the same thing again. It was mental.
I think the argument was that they wouldn't have been able to get the India trade deal unless the economy was on surer footing. That was the argument.
Which was an argument in response to questions about whether they're going to U-turn on winter fuel.
Yeah, I think their position is, the impression I had was that their position is they're claiming that the economy is in a slightly better state than it was last summer. There's some evidence for that, some against. We've seen a number of interest rate cuts. We've seen a very small amount of growth, but also inflation yesterday was up to 3.5%. So it's definitely, I haven't seen anything in the last 2 weeks that would suggest that the economy suddenly turned around. And the only thing that has changed in the last 2 weeks is Reform did really well in the local elections.
Yes.
So this is 100% a political decision. But that doesn't mean that's a bad thing. It's unfair on pensioners to not know the details, to get this partial U-turn in May and be left until late October in uncertainty about whether they're going to get their winter fuel allowance next year. Because how can you plan? That's just, I think that's a lesson that the government should have learned. They did this last year as well, where they announced the winter fuel cut in July and then left it for ages sort of on its own with no detail on what other support they were giving to pensioners.
i.e. the uprating of the triple lock.
So this time they seem to be making the same mistake again. But I would also say that you've been calling for a long time for this decision to be reversed, and so praise where it's due. They are starting to do what we've been asking.
Well, obviously welcome the U-turn, although it does bring into serious question, you've got people like Morgan McSweeney at the heart of Downing Street is apparently an incredible political tactician, and yet he didn't realise that taking welfare away from pensioners would poll poorly. Do you think there's going to be a wider repercussion here about Treasury brain, orthodoxy changing that? Or do you think this is a blip and we return to normal afterwards?
I don't think this is a blip. I think this is the beginning of a shift. I think there's an acceptance in Number 10 that perhaps maybe they've delegated too much of the political strategy to the Treasury. And the Treasury have different end goals. That it's just a different way of working, right? It's not necessarily always the Treasury's job to set out a vision for Britain. They've got to make the numbers work. That's what their job is. But it's the Prime Minister's job to sell it, to find a story, to sell a story to the country. And I think the thing that so many MPs and councillors were so angry about after the local election was that they don't have they're being sent out without any ammunition. They're going out on the doorsteps. They've got no political cover. They don't know how to explain to the voters what the party is trying to do, and the voters are angry and people are getting nervous. I think Parliament's been sitting for long enough now, maybe however long it is, 10 months or something like that, that most of the backbench lot now I can see have decided they've made their peace with the fact that they're not going to be ministers and they might lose their seat in the next election. So people are starting to got nothing to lose. And that's why you see in the last few weeks loads of MPs, new intake MPs, suddenly breaking their cover because they are...
It's very interesting that two of the biggest themes of the last 5 years, especially the last 5 years of Tory government, if not longer, were no party discipline, even from the newly elected. You think back to the Blair babies of 97, they were really well behaved. And it seems like something in our politics, whether it's social media or a desire for attention in the media or whatever, it has changed so the new MPs are just simply not loyal as a Prime Minister may have expected them to be. And the second aspect is criticism of institutions. Again, we thought... I think a lot of the left thought this is just the Tories making excuses. They don't have the vision. They don't have the energy. If you've got the drive, you can overcome. And actually, I think the Labour government has discovered in very short order that Whitehall doesn't work properly for the politicians, that they're not as helpful as they need to be, that they've got an agenda of their own in some respects. And I'm hoping that there can be cross-party consent now. It may take a bit of humility on Keir Starmer's part to accept that not everything that went wrong under the previous Conservative Prime Ministers was entirely the fault of Boris and Liz and Rishi. But actually,
Some of it was their fault.
Oh yeah, no, I just said not everything. Some of it, a lot of it was their fault, but a large part, a third of it maybe, was about a breakdown of parliamentary discipline and the problems of the civil service.
Last year, I had a number of people from Number 10 and sort of ministers say to me, basically, that Dominic Cummings was right, like it doesn't work. And, they were like, we would never praise that man normally, but he was right. But the problem is why, reforming Whitehall, which is what Dominic Cummings was really obsessed with, and to be honest, is something that Labour are trying to do. The public don't care. It's a time consuming and low political gain thing to do, but it is the right thing to do for improving government. So it's really hard. Right?
Well, and this goes back actually, because my understanding with the reason why the winter fuel tapered off so suddenly, it's £11,500.
It's just the cut-off.
It's a cut-off, but it's a cut-off by virtue, my understanding, of basically DWP IT systems.
Yeah.
Which are just so analogue and so from the last millennium.
The only way they could work it out was to use the pension credit threshold.
Exactly. So you either had everybody get it, no one get it, or the pension credit threshold.
Which is so blunt as a system.
And you talk about it's an unrewarding. One of the best things a government could do is spend quite a few £billion upgrading government IT infrastructure. Now, that is one of the least sexy sentences you could ever put in a manifesto, right? But the implications from that is you'd be able to better control welfare. It would actually have a really material difference. But is the political will there? I'm hoping, perhaps as a result of this, mess, that maybe we could start to have a conversation that, sometimes we need to do things that aren't politically sexy, but are very politically necessary.
So we're joined today by Sumi Rabindrakumar from Trussell. Nice to have you along.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You guys have published a big report this week about the provision of emergency food parcels. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
That's right. We provided our latest figures for 24-25, so the past year, looking at the number of emergency food parcels provided in the Trussell community. And we found that it was close to 3 million emergency parcels were provided across the UK. And that was about 50% higher than it was 5 years ago, about 2.5 times the number that we were providing 10 years ago. So what we're really worried about is that we are not returning to kind of pre-pandemic levels, which were already pretty high. And we seem to be kind of baking in this new normal of really extraordinarily high levels of provision. And I think the kind of context is that our figures are just the tip of the iceberg. In that period of time, particularly since the pandemic, there have been lots of other providers springing up who are also providing similar kinds of support. So these figures are kind of the first warning sign, if you like, of just how bad, how persistent severe hardship is in our communities at the moment.
Did you notice a particular increase over the past year?
So it's been a slight decrease over the last year. Last year, we provided record levels, so it was just over 3 million. We're now providing just under 3 million. It's pretty minimal in terms of the change. And we know, as I was saying, that a lot of need is being picked up elsewhere as well. So rather than it being a sign of need decreasing, we don't think it's a positive news story. We think really need is, as it ever was over the recent years since the pandemic and cost of living crisis, and doesn't really show any signs of letting up.
Why do you think the figures are so high? What's driving this?
Well, we've seen at Trussell, we've seen a really long-term trend of increases year on year. And we know that the most immediate driver of that is issues with the social security system. Over that decade, we've seen cuts and freezes to basic rates of social security, and the people coming through our doors generally have income so low that they can't afford the essentials. That trend has accelerated with the pandemic and cost of living crisis. We saw just yesterday, inflation has jumped again. When you look at the prices of essentials at the moment, food, energy, they are far higher than they were a few years ago. So it's really kind of reflective of, for lots of people in our communities, that cost of living crisis, that living standards crisis is really far from over. And really the government is at a crossroads. It needs to choose now to decide whether it's going to change course, because otherwise by the end of this parliament, realistically, we're going to see food bank needs rising. If you look at the cuts on the horizon in social security, inflation and high costs kind of not really showing signs of easing, we can't see that this situation is going to get better. And we're at this point now that they have to make a decision about which way they go down, because the decisions they make over the next year are the ones that will have an effect by the end of this parliament. You can't turn it around sort of overnight. They need to start making a change now.
Because PIP is not an out of work benefit, right? One of the things that I think gets tangled up in this debate is around worklessness and this idea that sort of people aren't in work and so they're claiming benefits or using food banks. But actually quite a lot of people are using food banks who are in work but just aren't being paid enough to support their families, right?
You're right that PIP isn't an out of work benefit. So there are plenty of people receiving PIP who are in work, and actually PIP is a thing that allows them to work. So there's a question as to whether the government will be fulfilling its own goals if it cuts that support. Also, when we look at our figures, we did some research looking at people who are in severe hardship. So that's looking at a measure of deep poverty where people would be very likely to need to turn to a food bank or would be likely to need to turn to a food bank in the future. So income so low that you can't afford the essentials or have very little buffer to afford the essentials. And that shows that the majority of people are actually in working households. Majority of people in severe hardship are in working households. 1 in 5 people referred to Trussell food banks are in work. It's typically low paid work or insecure work. And that's the reason why the social security system is so vital. It provides that protection for people who have to take low paid work, who are in low paid work, to be able to afford the essentials, put food on the table, afford clothes, afford their energy bills, and so on. So that's we would question whether this is the right forward to make those cuts. I think there's also perhaps a bit of a leap of faith in that. I wonder whether it's justified when you look at the people who are affected. So over half of the people affected by PIP cuts, for example, are likely to be over 50, and the government is talking about moving all these people into work. We have to look at whether we have the right support in place, the right employment support to help over 50s, very close to pension age, to move into work. Like, are the right jobs there? Are the employers out there who want to take on over 50s? We know that older people face incredible employment barriers to enter work and to sustain work. And that sort of ageism within the workplace when it comes to recruitment. And so I think it's sort of slightly rose-tinted spectacles in terms of the employment outcomes we could get from simply slashing support, particularly PIP support.
I presume Trussell welcomed yesterday's all but confirmation of a U-turn on a large swathe of the winter fuel cut. Do you think yesterday opens up the possibility of a further U-turn on welfare cuts?
I think in terms of the sort of politics of it, it seems politically naive to think that the job is done by simply making a partial U-turn. What is that, a J-turn? I don't know. On winter fuel payments. We also think that there is both a moral and economic case to not progress with these cuts. We looked at some economic modelling, looking at what those levels of severe hardship does to people, and it obviously has many impacts, which you can well imagine are very well versed. But it also affects us all by driving up negative impact on people's health, by pushing people further from work. That affects our public services, it affects our economy, it affects our public finances. These have costs. These cuts don't just have cost to people, it affects us all and it costs us all.
Would you say you're disappointed by this Labour government, or were you sceptical before they came into power?
I think we certainly saw lots of things in the manifesto commitments that were very positive. The Labour government rightfully called food bank need a moral scar on our society. There are some really positive steps in the early days of the government around renters' rights, employment rights, social housing investment, you mentioned. And we can see some positive things in the autumn budget, for example. They've introduced something called the fair repayment rate. It's probably not something that lots of people have seen or talk about, but for people who come to food banks, it really makes a difference. It's a policy that eases the burden of debt within the social security system. So when people have deductions from their payments to repay debts, it's placing a limit on how much money can be clawed back, and that makes a difference. Those are positive steps forward. And we've heard lots of welcome words from the DWP, for example, the Secretary of State talking about wanting to focus on support, wanting to create the sort of more welcoming environment within job centres, a more personalised employment support system. Those are all good things that the sector's been calling on for a very long time. But when it comes to the crunch, when it comes to the foundation that we all need of incomes which are high enough to at least afford the essentials, that is where this government is falling down and failing to live up to promises. Without a social security system that is there for us all, like the NHS and other public services, we hugely limit people's life chances, not just for this generation, but for the next generation. When you look at children, we hold back our economy and we hold back our public services. And so it's not just about us at food banks talking about this. This is about us. This affects us all. And that's really the standard we need to be holding this government to.
Do you think there's a broader issue as well around the idea that sort of food bank usage has become normalised as a concept, that years of austerity have cut back public services so much that there are systems that were always designed, like food banks or other things like in schools, like uniform banks and things like that, which were designed as temporary measures to alleviate poverty, that have basically become permanent because there is such a lack of support elsewhere?
I think that is certainly true, and it's one of the reasons we're so worried about the data that we released this week, which shows that sharp increase over the last few years. And we did a lot of work this time around speaking to food banks across the country. And the sort of consistent theme that we heard is that they're seeing this prolonged hardship in our communities, where one of the quotes was something like, all we see now is constant poverty, and people are having to come to us, stay with us for far longer than they would have done before. There is this new norm, think, of food banks just being there in our communities and picking up the pieces. What food banks are also telling us is that they are at breaking point. So one of the reasons we talked about the slight dip in figures compared to last year, one of the reasons we think is that food banks just can't keep up with the pace, that record pace of demand, that record level of demand. They're having to manage their capacity and resources. They're having to pay from their own sort of petty cash for food, to replace stock because donations are down. This isn't what a lot of volunteers came in to do. They thought they were just going to be here for a short while. They thought it was a sort of stopgap level of support. And volunteers are here 10 years later still doing the same thing. And they are both angry, frustrated, and just deeply sad about what they're seeing in their communities. And the other thing to think about is that there's a generation of people that have grown up now with food banks in their communities that wouldn't have happened 15, 20 years ago. But now the kind of donation point in your local supermarket is the norm, and it shouldn't be. And it's not what the public wants to see. So we're still waiting for that meaningful change that will turn the tide.
I can't believe this was also this week, but on Monday, we had a huge Brexit day. I honestly I woke up and I felt like I'd woken up in 2018. It was just horrifying.
Yes, we've got Brexit trade deal news, party infighting, government U-turns. We've just spoken about Dominic Cummings. I mean, it really feels like nothing's changed. But anyway, the headline is that Keir Starmer sold out the country.
No, it isn't.
Well, yes, that's a matter of opinion. I thought actually the criticism of the India deal was over-egged, and indeed, given where Trump is, I thought the US deal as an interim deal was about as good as we could have hoped for. I do think this is a really poor deal. If you compare what the EU's got versus what Britain's got, the ledgers are nowhere near balanced. And what have we got? I mean, we've got something on e-gates I mean, which isn't even coming in for this summer. And in return, we're matching their food standards. We're getting judicial oversight of British affairs again. We're coughing up cash. Apparently, that's the other thing. Apparently, the British military companies will be allowed to bid for contracts, which I doubt we'll ever get one. And also, our fishermen are being screwed over. I really just think this is absurd. We're not getting anything out of this. This is purely ideological.
I just think it's completely the opposite. What they've tried to do is do something that's sort of vaguely practical. That the majority of people, regardless of whether they voted for leave or remain, mostly just want the government to get on with Brexit. Just like, we left such a long time ago, just crack on, right? And what was one of the most obvious things that the public saw after leaving the EU was this e-gates issue. So obviously that's something that you want to try and address. Obviously you want to try and get rid of red tape for businesses, try and make it easier for people to export sort of food and drink to the EU. It's a huge market. So that all makes sense to me. But then it was just the same old like voices from so many years crying betrayal, and this is so terrible. Kemi Badenoch saying, fishermen have been betrayed, when all they did was extend a deal that Boris Johnson himself signed in 2021, and all the Tories were saying at the time, isn't this brilliant? It's the same arrangements.
Well, I think Brexiteers were very unhappy with the fishing settlement. They sort of bit their tongue. But
people like Victoria Atkins, who is in the shadow cabinet, were all at the time saying, isn't this a fantastic deal?
The current thing, right?
They'll never be happy, whatever it is.
Fishermen. Well,
and Farage was off on his sunbed because he was like, "Oh, this is a Brexit betrayal," but he's also on holiday and actually couldn't really be bothered to be here to even look at it.
It was an odd time for Nigel Farage to take a holiday.
It's half term next week. He couldn't wait. He had to decide to miss
a lot.
He's such a part-time MP.
He's a very full-time MP when he's here. The fisherman thing, just to explain, we had this sort of transitional arrangement between what it was in the EU and where we were meant to be heading, where we would have sort of annual quota checks, whatever. So this transitional deal was meant to expire next year. It's now been kicked down to, is it 2038. So we've now got this transitional deal, which, by the way, fishermen are really angry with the Tories. Let's be clear. They hated the Brexit deal because it didn't do them any favours.
And
they are even angrier with this because at least with the Tories deal, there was a sort of hope that things might get better from next year. So that is a big sellout. And you talk about these e-gates. I mean, firstly, there was never a ban. There was never anything in the Brexit trade deal that the Tory side preventing us Brits from using e-gates. It was a country by country decision. This deal still requires sign-off by each individual country, which may not be forthcoming. And even if it is, it's not going to be in time for this summer holiday. So, brilliant. Okay, brilliant. And lefty musicians get to tour more easily. Meanwhile,
I don't think
the Great British Sausage is being controlled by Brussels.
I mean, the Great British Sausage wasn't even able to be sold in Europe until this deal.
And now British butchers are now being told how many nitrates they can put in their bangers. I mean, it's a disgrace.
With so much of this, there are so many people who are just never going to be happy. The purity of Brexit is impossible to create on earth. It only exists in Nigel Farage's mind.
True Brexit hasn't been tried.
Exactly.
To paraphrase communists.
Exactly. And so anything that the government did would be considered to be a pathetic sellout, whatever. They just have... I just think every voice I heard was just the same old whinging from the same old people. Most people just want to get on with this stuff. No one really cares anymore about certainly in terms of the public, about anything to do with the Brexit deal unless it involves freedom of movement.
Well,
immigration is the only thing that still polls that the public are concerned about. And that is not a part of this deal.
That's a fair point. And for all my protestation, I don't actually care. But let's talk about free movement because, of course, a big part that was meant to be part of this deal was about youth mobility scheme, which, as with the US deal, a lot of this deal seems to not actually have been agreed and seems to have been a starting point for further negotiations, including this youth mobility scheme, which may or may not have a cap. It sounded at one point like there may be a cap, and then over the last week it started to sound like maybe Starmer's going to not bother agreeing one.
I think there is going to be a cap, and it's going to be time limited. So the idea is that somebody could come here for like a year or 2 years, I think is the idea. But you're right that it obviously there was some suggestion for over a period of months that maybe it would be a part of the deal, this youth mobility scheme, and they clearly couldn't find a way through it in time. So it's something that is going to continue to be on the table. But I don't know. I mean, I think they are conscious of the fact that it has to be capped, because otherwise they leave themselves open to the accusation that it is some kind of change. Even if it isn't a technical change to freedom of movement, if you don't cap that, then you might have a problem about the way it looks.
I'm intrigued what Bridget Phillipson thinks of this deal, the education secretary, because the universities are already really strained at the moment. They've got all, we've cracked down on visas for foreign students, and the national insurance changes and all the rest. So universities are already struggling. Another part of this deal is that European students will be able to come here on the Erasmus Plus scheme and pay British student fees rather than international student fees. Now, the difference between that is about 30 grand a year or something. So universities are losing out as well, which seems to have been an under-discussed part of this deal.
No, that's a good point. I think that has been under-discussed. And I hadn't been aware of that as an issue before it was announced. Like, all the conversation had been around the youth mobility scheme and not really about Erasmus. But I think that is, universities' finances are absolutely at breaking point, so that is a concern.
Thank you very much for joining us for this series of The Division Bell. As ever, you can follow us on socials at Mirror Politics and at Daily_Express. Like and subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. See you again next time.